In 2008, SpaceX launches the Falcon 1, making it the first time a private rocket company went to orbit.
We have liftoff.
This would go on to completely change the space industry and start a frenzy of new companies. All the while, there's been one guy in the middle of it all reporting to us what's going on behind those closed doors. Ashlee Vance is a tech journalist, host of the series Hello World on YouTube, produced by Bloomberg, and the guy who gave us the first biography of Elon Musk in 2015. Since then, though, the space industry has kept on exploding, both figuratively and literally. And Ashlee's been at the forefront of it.
And then I walked out of Astra one day, and it's just like, I get so enthusiastic when I see people working on these rocket engines and struggling and just the energy of it all. And I walked out and I was like, no, screw it. I have to do this book.
A few years ago, he came out with When the Heavens Went on Sale that follows 4 companies, including the one that I was most interested in, Planet, taking a whole new approach to building Earth observation satellites. Now, much more recently, Ashlee's produced and features in a documentary about some of the same people. I got to sit down with Ashlee to nerd out about rocket companies, how one rogue NASA administrator basically gave us all of these new companies.
Who is this guy, man? I mean, he is so unusual. He did all kinds of black ops stuff.
And I touch on the time that I got to meet Vladimir Putin years ago. This was a really fun conversation. I think you're going to like it. This episode is sponsored by OpenCage. If you're building any application or tool that uses location data, at some point you'll probably need to convert place names or addresses into coordinates, or coordinates back into place names. And this is where OpenCage comes in. They offer a worldwide, affordable, forward and reverse geocoding service that's easy to use. OpenCage builds on top of open data sources, which grants much more lenient licensing terms than alternatives like Google, allowing you to store the data as you want and even keep it after you stop being a customer. You can also display it on any map, all at a more affordable price. OpenCage handles all the complexity of dealing with the messiness of the real world and provides a simple-to-use API that allows you to focus on your use case. They have a generous free trial that you can use to get started with no credit card required, and they offer a clear upfront pricing with a cancel at any time, no questions asked policy. To learn more, head over to opencagedata.com. I'll have a link in the show notes. As a side note, OpenCage is also responsible for hosting the GeoMob events, as well as the GeoMob podcast, for which I'll also have links in the show notes. Thank you to OpenCage for once again being a sponsor and for their continuous support of the podcast. I usually ask people how they would describe themselves to start. I'd be curious to know how you would do it, because you've done a whole bunch of different things. I think you started as a philosophy major, and then you became like a tech journalist. You've worked at a whole bunch of things, The Economist, The New York Times, wrote a biography about Musk. I think probably a lot of people have heard about that. Now, wrote a new book. You have a documentary. That's how you've done a bunch of things. You're at Thanksgiving and you just meet a bunch of new people or at dinner. What do you tell them that you do or who you are?
I guess it's kind of like a work in progress at the moment. I think I probably identified as a journalist for most of my career. That's really what I did, coming straight out of college, and was chasing that for a long time. I was a technology reporter, a business reporter. I tend to focus on, never really reported on consumer tech. I seem to be drawn to kind of eccentric personalities and people that spend long times building things and just hard engineering projects. And then in the last few years, I started to get into the video side of things. It was a bit of an accident, really. In some ways, I get to write these long magazine feature stories, and I would go on these trips, and you could do a lot with the words, but there were some trips I went on, I was just like, God, I wish there was a camera. Nobody is sort of filming this kind of stuff. There's like 8,000 food TV travel shows, but I'm interviewing these really interesting people. So we started making this television show called Hello World for Bloomberg. And then, to be honest, I mean, there's tons of it that I love. Writing is a very solitary experience, and this was the first time I really got to like collaborate all the time with a team, and but was very uncomfortable on camera and all that. And then, but I just, it sort of drew me more and more into filmmaking. So when I set out to write When the Heavens Went on Sale, that was the first time I tried to really make a movie at the same time, like a proper documentary film. That was quite a harrowing and difficult and long experience. And then subsequently, feel like I learned a lot from that. So yeah, I've just gotten into making more movies. I got another one that'll be coming out in January in Netflix, and I think appear to be in the midst of starting my own production company to go shoot some more films, and then have started doing. There's nothing really to declare to the world because they're in early stages, but actually doing some scripted stuff like a sitcom and a film as well, like a dramatized kind of stuff. So yeah. Anyway, I guess I just doing a lot of a mix of things. I guess but it all feels like it comes from this journalistic bent.
Yeah. That's what, like, yeah, I love that you're like just trying about a bunch of new things. I've heard you say that like you get to chase weirdos around the world for a living. Yeah. And that's just, I just love that description. And it's a thing that I've picked up on, either Hello World or your latest book. Like you hear about people who are doing things like early on. I think you met the Planet folks, for example, in 2012. Like that's really early on in their journey. And these are people that are starting things in a garage. I feel like you have a knack for finding people like these weirdos who are doing cool things. How do you hear about these people, and how do you get to, follow them around?
Yeah, you're the first person that's ever asked me this. I'm trying to think how this all sort of started. I mean, when I first started as a tech journalist, I was not savvy in technology at all. And so I started kind of reading, semiconductor textbooks, operating system textbooks, all this stuff. And I seemed to have developed like an affinity for engineers as opposed to, I would say, the executives that most of my colleagues were chasing. And engineers do interesting stuff and know interesting people. There's always somebody working on some strange project, and so I fell in with that crowd. And then it's always just what's kind of called to me. I like people who are on a quest. I like people who are trying to do unusual things. I try not to be too judgy of people. I just appreciate anyone who's doing something outside of the norm and really putting a lot of effort into it. And so that just keeps drawing me in. And then, to be honest, as I've done this over the years, it sort of gets easier and easier because your network of people, often these engineer builder type people, that's who they also hang out with, and so you keep getting pointed in these other directions. And then I just have a wide swath of interest. I mean, I've spent like 6 or 7 years on this space stuff, but I also cover biotech and AI and robotics and all these other things, and so just keep getting pulled in those different directions. But yeah, that's what it's my favorite part of the job is like in some ways, it's a very repetitive job. You're doing the same basic task over and over again. You're writing a magazine story, you're making a TV episode. But the most amazing part is, for a period of time, it's not just a couple days. I get to sort of inhabit somebody else's life for a few weeks, a few months, sometimes a few years. And I feel like it's like cheating in life. Like you get to... Obviously, I don't get to fully be in their body and their world, but you do get a sense of these other worlds, and that's really what keeps this all so interesting. Every day is like new, and you just get to see weird people and how they go about their world, and to hop between them. It's like I love it. Yeah.
The thing I've noticed is like your books, like they're about rocket companies, they're about like space companies, but they're mostly about people. They're mostly about like the people who have done this. And so when the heavens went on sale, like an alternate title for a book like this could have been like Black Ops general has a bunch of kids and like tries to go rogue on NASA or something like that. Like
I thought about stuff like that. It was like a general Ukrainian spy and like a bunch of friends. No, I mean that's super perceptive. I always think of the technology really as like secondary to the story that I'm telling, which is mostly about the people, and it's the people that get me interested. If you're going to spend that many years of your life, you better sort of be interested in the humans who are doing whatever's going on. And then, I almost called the book The Rainbow Mansion because the story that really made me want to do the book was this group of friends that lived in this communal house. They all worked at NASA Ames. The people who would go on to found Planet Labs and Astra, and they lived in this communal house called the Rainbow Mansion. And it felt like that was really the core of the story that I was telling. And then just as time went on, I ran into Peter Beck and Max Polyakov, and it was like, well, I can't not put these people in a book because they're so extraordinary. And so then I just felt like I had to branch out a little bit with the title and the framing, but I actually kind of regret not calling it The Rainbow Mansion. I just saw yesterday I got an email. My South Korean publisher actually called the book The Rainbow Mansion and put the Rainbow Mansion on the front cover. So I guess they had similar.
Like a photo of the place.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
The gist of it is you have this guy who is just making waves in the government, and he just wants to shake things up. This is like early 90s, early 2000s.
Yeah.
And he just wants to really shake things in. He thinks like we need fresh blood in these projects. And he just goes out and he meets these people at a bar and he has an argument with them.
Yeah.
And in the movie, Will Marshall, one of the founders of Planet, talks about this. Like they have an argument at a bar. And then the next day he receives an email from this general. It's like, hey, I really liked our argument. Do you want to come work with me? And so he brings in these people, and they start doing a bunch of projects sort of under the hood at NASA Ames. And so some of them start Planet. Astra is a rocket company that gets started. At what point do you realize like these people's stories is worth telling? Like this is a book here, and I'm gonna just go all in, follow these people, and just write about who these people are, what they're doing.
Good question. Well, so you're talking about Pete Worden, who was a brigadier general in the Air Force, and he used to run a big chunk of the Star Wars missile defense shield program and did all kinds of black ops stuff. So I'd known Pete for a long time. I live right by NASA Ames, and so as long as Pete had been running NASA Ames, like you said, kind of going back to, I think it was like roughly like 2005, if my memory serves. He'd been. It was a pretty crazy story. Pete was running this like disinformation campaign after 9/11. The U.S. wanted to go spread propaganda through the Middle East of what a wonderful place we were and how awesome democracy is. And Pete was kind of in charge of that campaign for a brief period of time till the New York Times found out about it. And it made running a secret disinformation campaign kind of difficult. And so Pete had to take the fall for that. Donald Rumsfeld and George Bush fired him. And as a reward for that, they gave him the NASA Ames Center. And so I sort of like fell in love with Pete first, I would argue, because I was just like randomly going to NASA Ames to report different stories. I think I'd heard about like the phone sat project at some point, and I was just like, who is this guy, man? I mean, he is so unusual. He's like a total bureaucrat. He's running this bureaucratic organization. He's from the Air Force. You like, at least in my head, I had all these kind of stereotypes and ideas about what I thought that sort of guy should be like. But you could tell that he was different and was trying to like shake things up and was just really unusual. So I like interviewed Pete off and on over the years. I interviewed him for my Elon book because he'd been involved with the Falcon 1 rocket as part of DARPA. And so like in the back of my head, I actually was always thinking, oh, is there a book about like NASA Ames and Pete? Because NASA Ames has this fascinating history. And then Pete, I actually thought about doing a biography on Pete for a period of time because he's lived such a crazy life. And so I think all that was like percolating around in my head. And then to be totally honest, coming out of the Elon book, I mean, I loved the SpaceX reporting the most, but like I did not want to be kind of pigeonholed as like a space reporter, and because I just write about so many other things, it just felt weird to do that as like the next book after the Elon book, and then I resisted it for years and years and years. That's why there's like so much space between my Elon book and this one. But then I couldn't resist it anymore. And so, yeah, sort of like I'm saying, I mean, that first story where I was like, there was a period of time where I just really thought I'm going to write about Pete Warden and the Rainbow Mansion, and that's the whole book, And you could make an argument that maybe that's the more sane sort of controlled way to go, and then the rest of the action of what was taking place in the real world just kind of carried me through the rest. But I resisted for a while, and then I remember I walked out of. I told my wife, I was like, I can't do this book, I can't. And then I walked out of Astra one day, and it's just like I get so enthusiastic when I see people working on these rocket engines and struggling and just the energy of it all. And I walked out and I was like, no, screw it. I have to do this book. I don't care. I don't care if anybody reads it or not. I have to write this.
You get to film Chris Kemp and the Astra journey, like pretty much from day one. Like you guys have footage when they're breaking in the building and they're like looking around what will become basically their factory, compared to some of the other stories where, you come in like midway through the story.
Yeah.
That's a whole other thing. Like you get to see, basically, from what I understood, he told you, like, you get to tell the story no matter what.
I mean, I'd heard these rumors about this secret rocket company in San Francisco, and before Astra, there was this tiny company called Ventions that was run by Adam London, the co-founder of Astra, and they were like this weird sort of like military contractor who would work on some very small rocket systems. And so I'd heard about them, and I'd heard about Adam, and then I heard it had sort of like evolved into the secret rocket company. And then I was actually with Robbie Shingler, the co-founder of Planet, at some event, and I was like mentioning it. He's like, oh yeah, that's Chris Kemp. He's like, I can take you over there. And so then,
because these people are all part of that Rainbow Mansion. Like they've
all been friends for like 20 years, all grew up together at NASA Ames. Yeah, I call them Pete's kids in the book. It's all these young people Pete recruited. So I heard about it, and then I think Chris had wanted to keep everything secret, and then I was like, oh, okay, this journalist knows. So then he said, look, why don't we do a deal, man? It's like, if you'll keep us secret, you can follow anything you want until we get to orbit for the first time. And I was like, okay, you don't usually get an opportunity like that. He's like, come as often as you want, write whatever you want. He's like, if you want to document this journey, let's like do it. And so I started going as a reporter, and then I was like, oh man, we got to film this. It literally, when I first started going, it was me and 5 people in a room trying to get a engine to light for 0.25 seconds was the literal goal. And I would stay there till, I don't know, 2 or 3 in the morning, just in this really grimy building with all this handmade stuff. And then I was like, wow, we got to film this. And so we kind of spun up the film project. But yeah, so, I started reporting a little bit earlier, but we got cameras in there almost from the very first moments. And so just a totally unique experience. I think when I reported on the Elon book on SpaceX, my favorite part was always the Falcon 1 days, when you had these 25-year-olds who were like stuck on Kwajalein trying to build a rocket. And I think when I walked into Astra, I was like, it always made me sad, because I started reporting on SpaceX kind of late, so I never got to see that stuff firsthand. And I was like, if nothing else, I just thought, oh, this would be it's not exactly the same, but it's pretty close to what it must have been like. So I can actually watch what this must have looked like firsthand and experience it. So that's what drew me in.
Was it ever problematic? Like it's one thing to say that like you start a company and like no matter what you can film us, but you have to be delusional to start a company at some point, at least a little bit, that like it's just going to work out.
Yeah.
And like you can see that's exactly the kind of person Chris is. Like he's really like go go go,
Yeah.
but like things don't turn out super well for them. Like they struggle to get to orbit, and like just recently, like I think they announced that they went public, and then they were about to get delisted because their shares were going down, and they basically just announced like a couple of weeks ago that they were going private again. Like this is a rocky road to go on, and so like was that ever a problem when things got harder? Did he back trail or?
Yeah, no. To Chris's credit, I don't know. People have very mixed reactions to Chris in the film, so you'd have to ask him, how he feels about all these decisions now. But no, to his credit, he always lived by his side of the deal. I know Chris and I still talk and we get along. I think I know he was like upset about some of the things I wrote in the book is probably like a little more full throated than he was expecting on some of
Seems
these.
to be a trend. I think Elon had the same reaction.
Same thing. I mean, Chris was actually Elon was pretty good, but Chris was even more really letting me see like, man, for the first 50 employees at Astra, it was just like I just knew everybody by name, and I would just walk in.
Right.
Everybody like you get to this point where you're not this weird journalist stalking. I just show up and roll in and either be reporting or we turn the camera on. That's why some of the footage in the film is like stuff you've never seen before. It's like the rocket just blew up and we're sitting there with the camera and it's because they're used to it, and we were not like wasn't like a reality TV show. We didn't go there every day and just film everything, but they were used to our presence and they knew that we were look, all of this comes from a very genuine fascination with what they were doing, and so I think if nothing else they knew like our intentions and interest was in the right place. So no, I think it's like the thing I'm maybe most proud of from that movie is like you never get to see things like this. I think it's like an actual depiction of the reality of what it's like to run one of these companies, what it's like to do this kind of work, and so I give Chris all the credit in the world for making some of that possible. As time went on, the biggest change that happens, and you noted it earlier, we had caught some of the companies at different stages in their life. And so the worst thing as a reporter and a filmmaker is just as a company grows, it gets more serious, things get a little more buttoned down. Then they all went public during the SPAC craze. And so then all the lawyers show up and they're like, what? You've been letting a film crew hang around for years? What? And then once the companies go public, I would say Chris was never trying to hide some some difficult moment, but it just, you can feel that things have buttoned up and got tighter and it just gets a little bit harder.
I was amazed that in the movie, like you see them edit the tweet where they talk. So the rocket, doesn't make it all the way. Like they launch a rocket, it launches, but it doesn't go all the way to orbit. And they're right there, and they're basically like, Chris wants to write like total mission success, and they're going back and forth, and they're like, nah, man, we can't say that. And so they're like, total success, and they're like, I don't know, and they just put success, and like that's the kind of thing where like, yeah, if you're a public company, you probably don't want people to know that like you're talking about that. You want to be very picky. Like I was actually impressed that still made it. Like that's really the behind the scenes of what happens at a company.
Yeah. I mean, look, well, the way these things work is like, it's not like Astra gets to see the film at the end and tell us to take things out or anything. So once it's done, it's kind of done. I love that moment. I'm trying to remember. I mean, I'm pretty sure they were still a private company during that time. And so, even there's no real like legal ramification. You can't have a shareholder come later and try to try to
Yeah.
sue you over that.
I want to get into Will Marshall and Robbie Shingler. The reason I picked up the book at the first place for me specifically was like I wanted to know the early story of Planet. Like,
Yeah.
I'm an aerospace mechanical engineer by trade. Like that's what I studied, and I actually felt a little bit disillusioned when I graduated, which was like 20. It wasn't even that long ago, like 2018, 2019. And I just felt like I'm French, and I felt like the French aerospace industry is like big thing. But it was, you go to Airbus and you work on supply chain optimization. Like, how can we make the A380 like just a little bit more efficient or that thing? And honestly, it was depressing. And I just didn't want to go towards that. And so at that time, there's satellite images start to really be really available. And you have this thing called machine learning and computer vision that starts popping up. And I get really excited about that because just from my laptop, I can start doing stuff. And so I get into that, and the rest is history. I've worked in the industry for a while now, but I didn't know the early days of Planet. And so I was really curious to know about the company and then kind of learning about all the other characters in the book. But I'm curious to hear like your thoughts on them. You know, you wrote about them, but
Yeah.
you know, like how they come across. The book opens up where you go to India with Robbie, like
Yeah.
just who these guys are and what you thought about them.
I mean, same sort of thing, I guess, with Pete Warden in a lot of ways. You know, I found them just really interesting. They have this crazy friendship. I mean, they live in a communal house. You know, they used to live in the Rainbow Mansion, and they still live in a communal house in San Francisco now. And it's a very unusual friendship. They have this group of like 40 friends or so that have been buddies for 20 something years. And I don't have friendships quite like them with this group, you know, where they make all these like social contracts with each other and really are involved in how each other live their lives. And then I remember the first time I met them way back in the day, Planet's really evolved a lot because, you know, I think in a perfect world, I assume they would not have really wanted to turn this into a business because they did come to this from this kind of do-gooder perspective of wanting to track the environment, and that was really the goal. I think they were forced into raising a bunch of money to go build all these satellites, and then as a public company, they've been forced to do a lot of things. You know, I think I think they're great guys. I think for the most part, they're doing good in the world. I think they downplay, you know, their dependence on certain parts of the government these days and where a lot of their money comes from. I don't know. I don't think they're like dishonest about it. I don't know that they always, really, I don't think Will has fully internalized what a capitalist he has become. But, you know, Will, I interview lots of interesting, smart people, obviously, as part of my job. And Will just really stands out as a proper scientist, someone who really is brilliant. And I write about it in the book. I mean, he does have this, he's one of those people that's just like always in the right place at the right time with the right people. He's got this weird sort of like magnetism about him. And so all of that started to draw me in. And then I think I mentioned, you know, even way before I thought about doing a book on any of this, way before Planet was even really like a thing. I mean, I had seen the PhoneSat project and some interns from all around the world working at NASA Ames on this thing. And so that's really, I just thought it was really cool. It was a very cool idea to finally get Moore's law into space. I mean, it was baffling to me that satellites were not using some of this modern technology at their disposal. So yeah, I think it's an important story. I still don't think people really understand what's happening.
Have you talked to them like since they went public? Because a lot of the early, like it goes public, it goes well, and now it's kind of gone down. Like there's also this weird place where you hear about what the company is doing and like on paper it looks amazing, and then you look at the valuation of the company over time and it's just going down and down and down and down. And it's this thing where if it's a rocket company, like you look at Astra Rocket Lab, like it's it's very easy. It either goes up or it doesn't. And from a business point of view, Planet is this complicated thing. Like there's even in the documentary, like there's this whole part where you basically have someone that explains why it's a big deal.
Yeah.
And so like, have you talked to them about that sentiment where like now they need to convince other people that what they're doing is worth it, and it's harder than showing that the rocket could go up?
Yeah, we've talked about that a lot, and then I just think about this a lot in general. It is this amazing technology. I mean, it really is. It is basically kind of like Google of planet Earth, and you would think that would be worth incredible amounts of money. I think it's been so hard to get people. It still seems like most of the people who use these satellite images are the people who've been using them for years and just have more of them now. And it's this thing where the only way this gets really big is if we're discovering new uses for this imagery that people hadn't thought of before, that is getting into entirely new kinds of businesses, and that just, it's been really difficult for that to actually take place. I've seen, I didn't know which way this would go. I would say like Starlink as a communications platform has actually grown faster than I expected, and I thought imaging might really be a much bigger business than it has been so far. And so yeah, I mean that's the struggle that they're in. I mean, same thing. They want to do all these things to help out the world, and that really was their personal motivating factor for starting this, and now they're in this awkward position where you're dependent on these contracts to stay alive and keep the technology going, and you have to do deals with people they probably would not have really wanted to at the very beginning. And so yeah, it's a brutal thing. I'm curious what you think. Do it's like the multi-billion-dollar question as to whether this imagery, ever,
Yeah.
ever kind of really gets way more mainstream and widespread than it is.
It's interesting because I really feel like the war in Ukraine brought the value to a lot of people. Like, and you guys talk about it in the documentary. Like, they have this really powerful thing when you're trying to piece together like what's going on in this war, and now you have these people that can give you images of the entire world like multiple times a day. From a journalist point of view, like this is, and it was front page material.
All the time.
And so their name is everywhere. And I'm also surprised that like that didn't translate to, oh, this is like a gold mine. But it's a very different use case than I think what they're going for. At the end of the documentary, you guys also show Will saying like AI is the thing he's really excited about.
Yeah.
And that's where a lot of the satellite image world is going to. But I feel like we're all trying to figure out like what's going to happen, because these satellites are really, really expensive. So the images end up being really expensive. So you have this weird handover as well, where if you're a software engineer and you're like, I'm going to build a cool app, because like that's what you want software engineers that are going to build software companies basically. And then you see like one image costs $500 or like $1,000. You're like, this is weird. Like now I'm paying more to buy images than like all my cloud compute and all my cloud storage.
Yeah.
And on top of that, it's really hard to buy these images. There's a lot of people talking about how it's basically people who've figured out how to send rockets, like the hardware part, which is really like sending something up there should be really the hardest part. But actually, you need user interfaces now, like the boring stuff that's not as exciting as, yeah, we're going to strap it to a rocket. But I think that's kind of what you need to get people to use those images at a really large scale.
Yeah.
And
I'm
I
sure.
think part of the answer is the licensing, like all these boring problems where like
Yeah.
they've made these amazing tech and then it's like licensing, and that's kind of halting the whole industry.
I'm sure
I,
these things will evolve and get better over time, and then you know I also think the archive of all these images over time will be very interesting to use as well. But yeah, I mean the Ukraine thing, it was nuts. I mean, it was just like everything I'd been studying and writing about, and then but it's like what's the who's paying for that? I mean, it's like militaries, and how big is the market for all that? Is that the NPIC book in the background that you have on your shelf?
uh, the
The
one,
one
no,
in the
I
middle?
have,
No.
it's a book by Thomas Sager about, this one, the Essentials of SAR. It's about
Oh, okay.
radar satellite images because I'm a nerd and I just
Yeah, no,
have
but the cover is a little bit like that. Do you know what I'm talking about? There's this book
the
on,
Corona book, right, by John O'Connor,
yeah,
I think is his name.
yeah, the
Yep.
cover just from where I was, from my
No,
view.
I've got all the nerdy books up there. I've got another
Yeah,
one about radar images because, of course.
the NPIC book was fascinating, man. I mean, when you go back, like you were just talking about the software and oh man, I mean, the thought of these people having to do all this by hand on like hundreds of miles of film was just
Yeah, so the
unbelievable.
story is these like spy satellites in the 60s, and like how there's no digital stuff back then, and so they put this crazy. I haven't read the book, but I'd like to read it.
Oh my, it's,
Have him on the podcast as well.
he should. I mean, the book is quite, I guess it's awesome. It's a little bit maybe like drier than some kind of like mainstream book, but some of the stories are just unbelievable. They did the whole Corona project kind of in secret. They had to like disguise it as being some weird like science mission, and
Yeah,
then the rockets are blowing up all the time, and then they got to catch the film canisters in midair falling back from space, and then I mean they literally had miles of film that people have to go over manually. Just unbelievable to see how far all this stuff has come.
yeah. It's I mean, yeah, you're kind of preaching to the choir. I find this industry fascinating, but I think the analogy of Starlink has been really interesting because I don't know if we know like how. I think that's the business that's really working for SpaceX more than the rocket launches,
Oh yeah, that's the value. The value of SpaceX is tied to Starlink, whether most people realize this or not. Yeah,
which to me is just really weird because especially in the context of Ukraine, where again, like it's just free advertising at this point. Like everybody's talking about it. It's hailed as this hero for Ukraine, like this tech that basically saves Ukraine.
yeah,
And I'm surprised that the satellite image didn't get a chunk of that. It's not just images. Like ISI sold a satellite to Ukraine. Like that's big money. Like that's you're
yeah,
selling the whole hardware now, plus the support, plus all of that. Like it's boosted that whole industry. It's made it legitimate, but I feel like it's still stuck in this military aspect. Maybe
yeah,
it did it a disservice. I'm not sure.
yeah. I mean, you have to imagine a future where as the prices of launch still come down a bit, and the prices, now we're like just with Starlink and Planet. It's only the beginning of really like the mass manufacturing of satellites, and so it's still early days on all this, but you could totally envision a future where like every country is going to want a number of satellites of their own to be doing stuff, and I think that's probably where we're heading. These things just take a lot of time.
There, what do you think about you allude to that in the book as well a little bit, like the fact that everything's becoming private. So we were in a place where you're in the Apollo era in the 60s, like it's only government that can go to space. Like there's a few governments, but they're really just governments. It kind of all dries out for a few decades, and now there's this huge resurgence in just private sector is picking up to the point where you talk about this company Leo Labs, which is basically the air traffic controllers of space,
Yeah,
because even governments can't tell like where things are in space. So now we're dependent on these private companies. We launch stuff and we don't really, once it's up there, you can't really do anything. You can't police it. I mean, you can, Russia showed that they can shoot a satellite down, but
yeah,
it's still I mean, it's a wild, wild space, to
Yeah.
kind of, it's the Wild West.
Yeah.
But you kind of hint at that in the book, that like we don't really know where this is going to go. If you have a space that's now all of a sudden all private, there are some public programs still that are doing great, but it feels like launch, satellites, air traffic control, like all the support, the data centers these satellites use, they rent antennas from AWS to basically beam down images. Like all of that is just private industry. I'm curious what you think about that as well.
Well, in a lot of ways, I think it's inevitable, and it's going to come with all the good and the bad that you could imagine. I think the governments were. It's so funny, I traveled to like every spaceport I could. South America, Alaska, India, wherever, you name it, New Zealand. Well, the New Zealand one doesn't really fit into this because it's newer, but most of this stuff was it's crazy. It's like you're going into 1965 when you walk into these mission controls, and I think like there's probably like a lot of room for innovation, but every single one of these government programs just got stagnant and was just so dead set on doing things the way they used to be. And to your point, I mean, it's really funny because hindsight is interesting, because people had tried commercial space before. It had always failed. It was like an amazing way to lose tons of money. And then kind of like right when SpaceX started to hit their stride, maybe obviously doing well, but really kind of hitting their stride like 2015, 2016, 2017. And then Planet starts to get like their constellation around the same time. All this stuff just clicked so fast. I mean, it feels like this happened overnight, even though it was like 30 years in the making. But then things really did start to change. And people give me grief on sometimes about, well, like the government's still most of the money in a lot of this, which is true. Like, look, I mean, military pays for a lot of stuff, science, NASA, all these things, but it's like so obvious. I mean, look, if you just look at the number of satellites over the last 3 years, I mean, that number had been stagnant for years and years and years and years. Now it's quadrupled, and SpaceX is the majority of that increase, and companies like Planet and ISI, and so I think it's like totally false to argue that this isn't happening, and most of the SpaceX is so dominant in launch now compared to the governments. You can just feel this shift. I saw like the Leo Labs thing is really interesting. I saw this earlier this week. The U.S. government just handed a $480 million contract to some contractor I've never even heard of. I'm sure other people have, to beef up their satellite tracking system. And, that just strikes me as absurd. I suspect that at the end of that, $480 million will be quite similar to what Leo Labs can do today. Or maybe they should have given that money to Leo Labs to build a few more antennas. And so, I think we're at this moment where there's this tension. You look at like the SLS rocket from NASA. It's just absurd. Like we put these plans in place 15 years ago, and it takes so long to build some of this stuff that by the time it comes out, it just makes no sense at all. I mean, you've got SpaceX can do almost all the jobs of the SLS, and then even if you wanted two providers, Blue Origin almost assuredly will be coming with a second large rocket here this year or next, and so. The shift has taken place, and it's sort of like, how do we navigate it? To our earlier discussion, I mean, the business cases of space is still very much up in the air. So that's always the crazy question. I really try to get at this in the book. I don't think I had huge answers, but I wanted to make it explicit. Like, I do think you have to build the infrastructure first. You have to get launch to this place that we've worked all these years to. You have to get satellites to be modernized, and then build this infrastructure, and then see if there are new ideas that make a lot of money for people to chase. Otherwise, I don't know. This will be a very interesting exercise. Maybe all these companies will sort of tumble back into being government organizations that, because that's the only way to like really fund it. But I kind of have a feeling this is going to be big business in low Earth orbit as the years go on.
It does feel like that internet
Totally.
frenzy
Yeah.
of, I mean, I hear people talk about it. I was like 5 when
Yeah. I lived
that all
through it.
happened.
I lived through it.
But like it's from what I'm seeing, it seems the same. Where like we know, like just wiring people together, like there's something to it, but you can't predict Facebook and Airbnb and YouTube from there. Like,
No, definitely not. And you know, those even had, it's like first you had to build the internet, then somebody came up with the smartphone and made a company like Uber possible, you know,
yeah, 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 yeah.
and so we are just in the like building the pipes stage of all
Yeah.
this. And the way that played out in the internet was that people were like, oh, this technology seems revolutionary. No idea what somebody's going to do with it, but we should lay a bunch of fiber all around the world. And they did that. And then so some companies survived, and then some companies were on the wrong end of that. They spent billions of dollars laying fiber. The usage of the internet didn't sort of like ramp up as quickly as it needed to. So some of those companies went bankrupt, and that's what's going to happen here. You know, you're going to have some of the people putting this foundation that are not going to make it, and some that will, and then I'm dead set convinced we're like, if you think about stuff like drones, self-driving cars, like all this, I mean, we've talked about like Internet of Things for like 25 years, and it doesn't work unless you have some like always on fabric all around the world. And that's what we're building. So to me, I think there's no question in my head that if you have the assumption that something like Starlink, whether it's Starlink or rival services, but if you have the assumption that like high-speed internet is everywhere all the time, people are going to build really interesting things on top of that we haven't thought about yet.
I've been diving into and having people on the podcast that have built some of the mapping companies over time. And so like diving into the history of how Google Maps started, and like all the, like in hindsight, it's so obvious, like everything they had to build, but all the companies that were before that I just didn't even know existed, like MapQuest, like all these companies that just died because they were thinking about it, but the assumptions changed. Like, oh, now you can deliver data a lot faster, and it has these second, third order effects. And now the smartphone comes out, and it's like, on top of that, you have also these second, third order effects. Like,
Yeah.
It's interesting to try to use that as an example and then try to map it. I have no idea where it's going to go either, but it's really interesting.
I mean, every single one of these like cell phone, you know, we already see this happening, right? Like all the satellite direct to cell stuff. The US is going first in that with these various deals between Apple and T-Mobile and SpaceX. I mean, that's going to repeat all across the world. You know, there's no way that the rest of the world is going to be satisfied with just Starlink having a monopoly over this whole situation. So we're going to have definitely multiple giant constellations of communication satellites up there. You know, this is like early days. There's just no way we do not, something interesting happens out of all this. And
I feel like it might be actually, like we might have already done that with GNSS. Like nobody knows what that means, but it's because GPS is kind of has the mind share. But like you have these, they are mostly governmental projects. I don't think they're really private. The Galileos and the GLONASS projects, like all of these are government programs. But like you don't know which one you're using, like and it doesn't matter. But you just know that Google Maps and Uber know where you are. I'm curious as well. Like you talk about in the book, you talk about Will, who is British. He comes, he has a bunch of problems at customs. He has all these stories. There's Peter Beck, which is this guy who's like, if you were playing, I think like you and your kids play D&D quite a lot. Like it's like he rolls a 1. Like it's starting character, just terrible flaws, terrible place to get started to build a rocket company. But he pulls it off. Like he reads a bunch of books and he basically builds a rocket. And then the US tells him like, oh, there's this thing called ITAR. You can't do that, even if he's done it. I'm curious, like if you're looking around at other places around the world and like what companies around the world are trying to do. You know, still in the space industry, like, but if you're keeping tabs as well on, you know, companies outside that are trying to do their own thing.
In the space industry or anything.
Yeah, let's keep it in the space industry for now.
Well, like New Zealand is fascinating because, you know, nothing. And then obviously because of Rocket Lab, I mean, has about like 10 or 11 pretty fascinating space startups.
Right.
And Christchurch is this weird like like hub for a lot of this stuff. I mean, it's sort of when you go there and visit, it, like, doesn't mentally make a lot of sense, but Dawn Aerospace is really interesting. There's a whole bunch down there. I mean, it's weird because like when I first started covering SpaceX and like ULA, you know, this Boeing Lockheed company was dominant. I mean, the U.S. space industry was pretty sad, man. The space shuttle had just been retired. We were like totally dependent on ULA. Their sort of mission was to kind of like extort the government as much as they could, and hadn't changed their rocket in decades. And now, like, all of a sudden, I mean, the U.S. is amazing. We've got rocket startups falling out all over the place. We got tons of satellite startups, people doing all kinds of interesting things. It's like incredible to see, really. I don't think people fully internalize how different it was. And then New Zealand strikes me as kind of like second after that, and then maybe Europe. I suppose Europe is always so much potential, but you know, I mean, God bless you made the Ariane 6. This is quite reminiscent of the SLS in some ways.
Yeah,
just
no, I totally. I worked at ESA I got an internship at ESA in like 2018 because I tweeted about Kerbal Space Program, the video game.
Yeah.
And like some guy DM'd me and was like, "This is cool. Do you want to come visit ESA?" And I was like, "Heck yeah."
Yeah.
And one thing led to the other. I ended up having an internship in communications of all things. I didn't care. I was at ESA. And like I remember we were like basically 2018, like making some of the promo stuff for Ariane 6 because it was about to go up. And I was like, of course, like moved on, go do something else. And then like, oh, it just happened now.
And
so, yeah, I get you.
All these governments, you know, when I first started doing the SpaceX reporting, I mean, they're just like, you know, reusable rockets won't work. It's going to bankrupt SpaceX. Even if they do work, it's pointless. Now you're screwed because you know how long it takes to design these things. I mean, so if you weren't even like assuming that would work, now you're like 15, 20 years behind and like starting from scratch. So God bless, man. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know if there's anywhere else that like really jumps out. I'm so fascinated to find out what happens in Russia with their space program over time. I don't think the world is really paying attention to how this might play out. I mean, it's a country. Well, you know, Russia. Look, the space program there is not just like it's not just some point of interest. This is pretty deeply woven into the fabric of their national pride, and is like a cultural phenomenon, and is now being crushed both by their usual own corruption, which they can kind of get over to some degree, but now the war in Ukraine is cutting off these Soyuz customers, and then SpaceX has just like obliterated their business, and Russia has no, that I know of, real commercial space anything. And so like, how does this very proud space superpower react in these next 20 years? And I think it's quite badly. I mean, the only thing you can do to be relevant is to be a pain in the ass to everybody else. And so I assume that's like the position that they will take, especially if Putin's still in power. And so, man, I don't know that I find this fascinating because, okay, if we go back to what we were talking about before too, it's like We've got Starlink. You've got OneWeb. China's obviously going to build a giant constellation. China's space program is going quite well. But so, like, is what really will be like Russia's answer to this? What will be Europe's full-throated answer to this? What would be like South America's real answer to all of this? And so, like, I think the political and struggles and everything, they're going to get very interesting. But sorry, go back to your original question. I don't know. Yeah, the U.S. and New Zealand and a bit of Europe sort of jump out to me as the most interesting, maybe, spots to be.
Yeah, I actually did a few months in Russia. Like when I was a student, I wanted to go there because, like, well, you don't get to go there very often, and just like their aerospace like building like over the last decades was impressive, like just by the resource they had and what they were able to do. Like, and it's a thing, like you can tell they're proud of it. Like just going there and seeing the buildings, like there's just planes, there's huge museums, like it's very reminiscent to how it feels like in the US.
Yeah, but I think it's even more pronounced. Like the Russians are very like philosophical, science proud people. And, in the Soviet vision of where the world was going, it was like a key component that we would transcend this planet and carry human intelligence throughout the universe, like this kind of progress. This is I think it's like bound up in their culture in a way that it's the US is like this patriotic kind of we're explorers and we're
right
good scientists and things, but I think it's deep down in the Russian soul.
This is really anecdotal, so like take it for what it's worth. But I actually met Putin in 2017.
Oh wow!
And like it was this wild story. We got invited to Sochi. They revamped the entire Olympics area for these like youth, and I don't even remember what it was called, but it's like basically like festival for youth and like young people, and like look at how amazing it is. And because we were exchange students at basically like one of the biggest engineering school, MIPT, I think it's called. It's like MIT, but in Russia. And we got invited to that thing, and it was like 30,000 people. They basically redid all the banners. Like you look at what Paris is like right now with, everything has banners everywhere. Like they changed all of that just for that like 1 week event. There was an air show at the end, and Putin showed up like in a stadium. And I was there like as an aerospace engineer student, and we were there basically attending talks all day. And I was part of like this aviation group, and they needed someone to like talk for like 90 seconds, just 90 seconds about like, what's the future of aviation? And they had like 12 different groups like that, like about agriculture and transportation and politics and like maritime. And I just loved that. So I just like jumped in it, and we spent 2 days preparing that like 90-second thing. And at the end, we rehearsed. There were like TV cameras, and Putin showed up in this small room with like 100 people or something. And I got to talk about like, I think airports are going to be easier to walk in because you're like going to have cameras that are going to see if you have guns on you or whatever. And supersonic flight, like I don't really know if it's going to happen, so we don't know. And at the end, he like listens to everybody, and he gets the microphone and he starts talking. He's like, who's the guy who talked about the like aviation stuff? And so he like, okay, yeah, here. And so he turns to me and is like, I don't think you're right. Like we built the Tu-144, that was like, it flew before the Concorde, even though it crashed. And we're going back in there. And I just remember, like, first of all, I was, terrified because this guy is like, it's Putin. But also being like, wow, this guy feels like there's this pride in the, aerospace and the industry in a way that I don't think I would feel like from a politician from, France or Europe, maybe even some in the US. This is very anecdotal, but it's something that, of course, very marked me, but that I remember. But I felt this thing where like very proud about like this a specific part of like in the industry in Russia. So yeah, I'm not surprised.
No, it's fascinating, and I think it'd be really interesting to see how this all plays out.
What are you excited about? Like, are there people that you're following now that are the the Astras or the planet that you're just keep an eye out, or you want to have a camera crew around to meet up? Not you said you don't want to be the space guy. I know you're following a lot of different things in a lot of different industries, but like, are there things where you just keep going there and you end up with them until 2 a.m. in the morning?
I mean, it is mostly outside of space now. I kind of, after I finished When the Heavens Went on Sale, and we were nearing the end of filming for Wild Space. I just had to think about something else for a while. So I spent the last year following that longevity guy, Brian Johnson, around
right.
with a camera. So we got a film coming out about him. And then I've gotten pretty deep into brain computer interface stuff now. I've been going to Neuralink and a bunch of their competitors a lot. And then artificial intelligence. I'm working on a book on OpenAI and Sam Altman and some of that. And so, yeah, I got a little distracted for a second. I'm still really interested in Boom. You were talking about supersonic flight. Really fascinated to see if they can pull that off. I remain super fascinated by Peter Beck. My gut tells me we have, it's early days with him and where his life and Rocket Lab are heading. And so those characters keep me interested. And then Max Polyakov and I stay in touch. I mean, he's gotten really sucked into the war in Ukraine, and I'm kind of like everyone. I wish the war would be over, and then I could see a scenario where Max, depending on how things shake out, kind of ends up helping rebuild Ukraine if given that opportunity. And I suspect would try to piggyback on a lot of this drone work they've done and build like a new aerospace industry of sorts there. But no, I haven't been as deeply involved in companies like Stoke Space or ABL, some of the new rocket companies that are coming. I got burned out, if I'm honest, a little bit, and just have to think about other things.
This podcast is called Minds Behind Maps. I'm interested in the people. Like I find the people like the most fascinating part of like what they do. Do you come across as like, do you start getting interested in something because there's a wild character or there's an interesting person, or because the project is different and new or interesting? Like which angle do you approach it with, or is it just a mix of everything?
Usually, I think I probably hear about the project first, and then I have this wonderful job. I mean, my day job is a magazine writer for Bloomberg Business Week. So I hear about like an interesting project, and then I get to go spend some time meeting the person. And then that's when it like, I know where I'm going to spend my time after that is like,
right.
does the person kind of match the idea? And when they do, that's when I get stuck in. But because I'm always looking at all the different technology stuff, and then I mean, you were talking about before. I mean, I have this horrible, it's like a curse and a blessing. I just, by nature of the people I talk to, and I think how my own brain is wired, I tend to sort of like run like 5 to 10 years ahead of when these things are actually going to be kind of mainstream or super useful. And the question is always like, is it 5 years? Is it 10? Is it 15? Is it 20? When are you gonna time your book or your movie, and what's going to be real? And on Heavens is like weird. I guess I felt like I timed it really right, especially like, God, I mean, it's not like I wanted the Ukraine war to happen in any sense, but like everything I'd been writing about just played out in front of people, like you said, on the front page and CNN every day. And so I kind of felt like I timed that one right. I still don't feel like the public has really gotten it and the huge shift that's taken place. Anyway, no, it usually starts with the tech, but the person is what like keeps me coming back.
Do you know how the documentary's doing? Like, do they tell you?
They don't tell us, man. It's very frustrating. I'm used to Hello World goes on YouTube
And you see,
in addition to Bloomberg TV, and I get to be a junkie just refreshing the page to see how many views it has. HBO told us it's like been really strong, but I have no idea
right.
at all
Okay.
what that means. And then anecdotally, the coolest part has just been it's like I think I kind of have like an audience for my work, and so I'll like sometimes hear from the same vaguely sorts of people, and then this one has been really different. It's like people I haven't talked to in 30 years from like my hometown or whatever, just like randomly ran across the movie. So you can tell it's reaching, a different group of people, and there's been a lot of those notes. So I kind of feel like it's doing well. I would love it if it just really took off. I've got a lot of extra footage that I could use to make wilder space if the opportunity arose.
I want to nerd out on that, like actually for a little bit on like
Yeah,
reporting just the industry. I saw you did an AMA on Reddit, and you said like there's no money in documentaries, but it's like one of the coolest things to do.
yeah,
And you just mentioned, or like when we were starting, like you're looking at starting your own production company.
yeah.
The media industry is going through a bit as well at the moment. Like doesn't really know where it's going. Like, how are you thinking about like the business of reporting on all these things, and like what format to do it in, and which one is sustainable?
Yeah. I mean, I'm 46. I have no idea what advice I would give to like a 26-year-old, because a lot of this stuff is horrifying. um, I mean, if I'm totally honest, I think I like put myself in a position to kind of be lucky, but like doing the Elon book, as far as somebody in my job goes, like financially, is like winning the lottery. I just timed that one really well, sold a lot of copies. Like just journalists don't get paid much money, and books usually make no money either. And that one happened to make money. It just like changed my family's circumstances, I guess, in a lot of ways, not like in like some crazy way, but like, materially. And then, yeah, it's really tough, man. Like on the documentaries, like I want to start this company, but it could be a fool's errand. I think after doing this second documentary on Brian Johnson, think I've like sort of figured out. I've learned a lot of lessons between the two, and I'm pretty sure I have a model of how to do this cost effectively and like keep a business being sustainable. I don't know that it would ever be like some multi-million-dollar. It's a very like hits-driven luck kind of business. I mean, maybe same thing if I stumbled into some character like Elon and you had the only footage, I'm sure you'd probably do okay, or if you had like if you had a series that ran for a bunch of years, you'd do okay. But yeah, it's tough. I don't know. I'm lucky. I have like the last great magazine job. Bloomberg pays me really well to do whatever I want, wherever I want. That like doesn't exist anymore. If I quit that job, I was like, there's no one that's gonna swoop it. It's just gone, forever. Like the great sort of, I mean, it's the coolest thing about being a magazine writer. Lots of times journalists trade money for the lifestyle of what you get to do. And so, yeah, anyway, I've been lucky. I've worked hard. I'm probably sort of like the last relic of a bygone era in a lot of ways. So I don't know, man. I think kind of like write it out as long as I can, and then and like hope I get to whatever 55 before the entire thing implodes.
Do
Yeah.
you because you have this series on YouTube, do you follow like some of the people on YouTube that are making
I do. Yeah.
cool
Oh,
engineering, like the real engineering, like everyday astronaut, like all these people
yeah.
making like just wild stuff as well?
Yeah. And it's really awesome. I'm always like, it's weird because, the show we make is quite high end. I mean, we travel with a small team overseas. It costs money it costs real money to make it. A lot of the people you're talking about, they've done awesome jobs, just like sort of having a camera with them on a stick or a tripod and getting really far, because they're knowledgeable and they're passionate and they're getting into interesting places. I've thought about doing it a million times, like sort of with Hello World. I just don't know. And then I can never fully tell the business model on YouTube. I mean, it really seems to be you build your audience, but you really don't make that much money off your clicks. I mean, it's off like other things that you're doing, whether it's a sponsorship or merchandise or something like that. And then the work I do is a little maybe I'm lying to myself. I just consider myself a little more of like a journalist than some of these channels that are kind of like hyping things or just and it gets really hard to sometimes figure out like the sponsorship thing that makes it still really legit and like you're not being compromised. And so that's like a battle. I mean, I've thought a million times of just like restarting Hello World on YouTube, on my own, and then I just wonder if I could do it at the level I want, or if I have to try to sell that to like a Netflix or an Apple or something like that.
Right. So either you go full scrappy or you go full on like super
Like high end.
production. Right.
Yeah. And then, the traditional production companies that do the high end stuff for Netflix and Apple and stuff, I think they're like egregiously expensive. And so I kind of think there's like a middle ground. But Hollywood is really weird. I mean, it's like set up. This is probably super boring to people, but if you get a budget from HBO, it's sort of obscene because the production company that's receiving that budget, I don't know why things evolved this way, but everybody knows it's like sort of a sham that is like the budget that you're getting is not actually what it will cost to like make the thing. And you're just supposed to like take out $1 million+ from that as like your overhead to pay everyone. Whereas like, I think you could have a more honest thing about what it actually costs to make the thing. And then a more honest conversation about like what could be paid on top of that to keep the business going. The whole thing is like this. You're like billing for fax machines and landlines, like literally in the budgets, and everybody knows that there's no fax machine or landline.
It's like
involved.
The old space industry. It's the same
right.
thing.
But it's like a $20,000 line item in this budget. And so like I came to this late, so I have no idea how all this kind of happened. But I know that I could still film something really high end, but with less money and make something great. And so anyway, I would like to try to do things a little different and see what happens.
Yeah, I think about these things, just like running this podcast. It's so interesting because I do see parallels with the space industry and with a lot of these things where it's like super expensive and then someone comes and like you can make it for super cheap and still make it. Like, and a lot of people burn out and fail in the process, but just like startups, I don't know. I find there's interesting parallels there.
Yeah. I mean, well, look, I mean, Hollywood is I'm sure it's a lot like the space industry. It's sort of like a disaster of bureaucracy and old ways of thinking. I'm trapped between the publishing industry and Hollywood. It's like not really, the apex of innovation.
I feel like this is a nice place to start rounding this conversation off. I like asking people, the same question at the beginning. I like doing the same at the end. I like asking for a book and a podcast recommendation. There's a couple reasons I do that. I mean, that probably better than I do, but I feel like books travel through word of mouth a lot. I think it's just a cool way to know about people, and podcasts are a bit the same. So if there's a book that you didn't write, that's the only rule. And then if you listen to podcasts, anything, just anything that we talked about or not, just something that you think is cool and people should check out.
Yeah, only because it's super top of mind because I was tweeting about it yesterday. There's this book called Sonic Wind. I think it's written by Craig Ryan. It's about this guy, John Paul Stapp, who I just am quite convinced is one of the most interesting people who ever lived, just super briefly in the 1950s, in the late 40s into the 50s. The U.S. military was trying to figure out like what the human body could endure. They knew planes were going to get faster. They knew we'd get ejected at like supersonic speeds, and then kind of like had in the back of their head that we might have a space program one day, and astronauts would have to deal with all kinds of things. And so this guy John Paul Stapp was actually like a medical doctor who enlisted in the military, and they're like, all right, why don't you go find out what the human body can endure? And there weren't a lot of willing test subjects, so he more or less experimented on himself a lot, and did some insane things to his body. I won't go through the entire book, but yeah, I would recommend that. I'm trying to think of like a really good. Let me look at my podcast list while I vamp.
While you do that, I actually know about him because my dad worked in seatbelts safety,
right.
And so like a lot of that comes back to still like what that guy went through, because it's a bit hard to get people to do it again, and so like I'd heard about these stories when I was younger.
Like, I mean, so he kind of like pushed the seatbelt to be a real thing. For like, you could argue he's probably saved more lives than just about anyone. All right, I'm going music for the podcast. It's called Cocaine and Rhinestones. It's not totally like a hidden gem, but I suspect it'll be new to some of your audience. It's this guy who just does these. It's all about country music, but again, it's more. You don't have to be into country music. It's more about the stories of these people's lives. And this guy does such unbelievable amounts of research. It has such a weird, interesting delivery for how he presents the information. And I just love it. I mean, it's you should at least listen to like one or two of them. It's pretty extraordinary. There's an episode on this female singer named Bobby Gentry. It's probably my favorite episode, and it will blow your mind, I think.
I haven't heard about that. That was pretty cool. Yeah. One super quick final question. I read in an interview you did, like a written interview in a while, you didn't ever want to have an iPhone because you didn't like you were into the open source, and it was like a principle. Do you have an iPhone? Did you change your mind on that?
I've got an Android. I get so much grief for it. I used to have a Windows phone for as long as I could.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, they're actually pretty good. It's like one of the, especially after they bought Nokia, they were really good. It's one of the sad parts of phone history, I think. Yeah, I mean, look, I'm not. I try not to lie to myself too much. I know that being on Google's, I've got a Pixel. Being all in on Google's probably no different to sort of being all in on Apple, and I've got a Mac and all that. But yeah, I don't know. I still have these open source roots. I was a Linux nerd for so long, and Android appeals to me. And then I try to separate my computer from my phone, which probably works. Maybe I'm just giving like double doses of all my data to everybody, but I didn't want Apple to have my phone too.
I've gone full in over the last few years, but I thought it was funny. Just wanted to ask
Oh my God, I get so much grief. It's like you're a second-class citizen when you enter a group chat. It's horrendous. I mean,
no, that's an American thing. Like, this is just I think it's really an American thing. Like these group chats. Yeah. Like everybody uses like WhatsApp or Signal or like whatever.
So I travel so much doing the show that I'm on WhatsApp all the time. It's weird that like WhatsApp runs the entire world except for the United States, and probably in China. But WhatsApp is like, it makes me sad that Meta owns it. But I mean, it really is the glue that keeps the world going. It's so funny. The United States has always been like this, man. We were like so far behind on mobile and telecommunications until the iPhone came along, and then we just always seemed to. It's like we weren't really into SMS messaging or anything like that. I don't know. We just have a weird phone culture here that's just always different from everybody else.
Always been weird. But like you go to I spent some time in Taiwan as well, and they have Line. You go to, I was in Russia, as I mentioned earlier. It's like Telegram and VK, which is like there's these entire parallel universes that you just don't know about.
Yeah,
it's a whole other conversation.
No, I mean we did a episode of Hello World in Russia. We kind of got into this a little bit. This idea. I mean, there really are like these if you count China, Russia, and the United States, you brought up good examples of like other places, but those are sort of like the three dominant like sovereign internets, and they just run by their own rules. It's so different to how the internet started. It's funny, but they are like these digital countries with their own culture, and it is amusing to me.
Yeah, I don't know where that's going to go either. But hey, Ashlee, thanks so much for your time. This was great. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you. No BS. You asked questions, almost every question I'd never been asked before. This is much more fun than having to like repeat myself. So thank you.
Well, that's music to my ears. Thank you. Yeah, this was a lot of fun. Hey, thank you so much for listening to this conversation. I wanted to take a moment to thank the sponsor of this video, but also all the people who financially support me on Patreon. If everything goes well, these conversations should feel and sound seamless and effortless, but there's a lot of work that goes behind the scenes. I try to research and prepare these as much as I can to know who these people are and what makes them interesting and what would lead to a good conversation. I'm incredibly thankful to all the people who support my work on Patreon, meaning I can do a little bit more of it. This podcast started out as a way to learn more about the people in this industry, but I've also started making educational content on another YouTube channel that I'll put a link to in the show notes. And I want to make more content explaining how satellite images and maps work to a broader audience, as well as continuing to research the guests for these podcast episodes. So if you value the work that I do, I'd like to ask you to please consider supporting my work on Patreon. There's also some behind the scenes of how this podcast is done and some of the work that I'm doing for these educational videos if you want to learn more about how I do all of this. Either way, thank you so much for all of your attention and your time. I really appreciate it, and I hope you get value from these conversations. Thanks.